Hey, John, welcome to the Entrepreneurs United podcast.
Thanks for having me, Rich.
Isn't that our typical intro? Feels weird, though.
It does feel weird.
I'm happy to chat with you on air. None of this is scripted. You have no idea what I'm going to ask. We're going to have some conversation about your book. So I got to start with this. First of
Yeah.
all, feel free to share the title of your book. But then after you share the title of your book, I've got to ask the burning question, why? Why write a book?
Okay. The title is The $100 Million Journey, Your Guide to Growing the Business of Your Dreams Without Going Off the Cliff. So that's the title. I got two reasons why. The first one is because I committed to you on January 1st of last year that I was going to write a book this year. And you committed to do a triathlon, and we've both succeeded in our missions in
We
2023.
did.
So
We
applause
did.
to that. And I'll tell you what, Rich, that peer accountability means a lot because it's one thing to say you're going to do something when you've vocally communicated to each other or to somebody, and you vocally communicated to the world via this podcast, which we did. There's a lot of accountability there to deliver. And you and I are both deliver what you promise type of individuals. So first, thanks for that. But the deeper why behind it is in 2019, I took a sabbatical after a pretty big failure and had to seek out what is my why? What is my passion? What do I really want to achieve? What impact do I want to make beyond myself in life? And figured out that really my why is I want to make an impact to entrepreneurs. And if I could help make sure they don't go through some of the painful pitfalls that I've had as an entrepreneur and help them achieve the success that they desire to achieve by owning a business or by being an entrepreneur, I can make an impact. And that's an impact beyond myself. And I felt the way to do that is to crystallize my learning. So not only crystallize my failures, but then also take the learnings from my failures, apply them to an actual business, and achieve the level of success I was actually seeking to prove out that the theories actually work to make the book more viable. So those are my two whys.
Yeah, thanks. I want to talk about what's in the book in a little bit. I first want to hear about your experience. Can you speak to what was your experience like from the idea of, I think I may want to write a book, and then some of the emotional undertones of that journey and getting educated about what it was and some of the transition curve and the ups and downs? And was there a point where you questioned, do I really want to do this? And then pushing through that. Talk about your journey of wanting to write a book to actually having one published.
Yeah. So I may skip over a bunch of those questions, so feel free to bring them back
Yeah.
and probe them there because there's a lot there. But you experience a failure. Your first thought isn't, oh, I'm going to go write a book, right? Your first thought is, what just happened? What on earth just happened? Am I the victim here? What's going on? I can't believe this happened to me. Then you start digesting that a little bit and it converts to, okay, I got to have strong fundamental ability here to regulate my mood and figure this thing out. The world's not craving down. I got my health. I got my family. Like things are okay. I'm going to survive this, but what did I learn? So you start moving that introspective mode, right? So perspective is the first part. I realized that I'm healthy, things are okay. Yes, I had a big failure, but I'm going to recover here. That's fine. That's perspective. And then there's introspection. And I think perspective plus introspection leads to progress, which is a formula I found and I abide to. But the introspective part for me, Rich, is I started journaling. And even through this podcast, which helped me, one of our early episodes, I wish I remembered exactly which episode it was, but very early, Dr. Julie Bell said, grab a blank sheet of paper every day and write for 20 minutes.
Yes.
Believe it or not, the impact that made on me to just write blank sheet of paper. What am I writing about? I'm writing about my learnings. I'm writing about what happened. I'm writing about what I would have done differently. I'm writing about all these different things. And then I'm able to find these themes and go, this one's a theme. This one's a theme. I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to do this again. And you start seeing the pattern starting to shape. And thankfully, I had another business that I was involved in and working on. I'm like, hey, we're not going to make the same mistakes here, but I still want to grow something significant. Let's apply these learnings over here. And we started applying those learnings over there, and we're able to successfully grow our business to north of $100 million the right way. And so all that's happening in the background. And when I knew that was going to happen, when I could see that our company was going to hit that mission, was when I felt comfortable saying, okay, I got to start this process. I need to document this stuff. And literally on January 1st of this year, when I said, Rich, I'm writing a book this year, we had achieved the $100 million milestone. I believe that I applied all of our learnings. Okay, now I feel I'm credible to put the story forth. not just that I had these learnings from failure, but I had these learnings from failure, did something about it, and proved that if you apply these principles, it actually works. So I felt that was credible. The accountability, as I mentioned, the pure accountability, okay, I'm going to do this, was a big driver. And you knew as well that I was trying to get this done by our Entrepreneurs United Empowerment experience, because I have
Yeah.
friends and family and other entrepreneurs around that I could share this experience with. That meant a lot to me. But the process of writing a book was very difficult. Not just the writing what happened, but trying to crystallize the learnings in a way that others could understand, provide resources to really help educate, the grammar, the editing, the format. Okay, now what do I do? Now I got to market this thing. Oh my gosh, who reads books anymore anyway? Now I got to do an audiobook. And certainly, Rich, it's not lost on me like this big part of imposter syndrome. Like, who wants to hear my story? Does anybody really care? That was a big part of it as well. Is yeah, maybe the writing was good journaling and mindset work for myself, but does anybody really care? And that was a really big piece of holdback throughout the journey, and getting out of my comfort zone to go, I don't care if one person reads a book. If it can change one person's life, then I did my job. If it can do more, then great. And I put the book out on that premise.
Hmm. I know back in our 20s, we had talked about writing a book. And if you remember the book that we were wanting to write, and I think maybe we wrote one or two chapters and we gave up on it. I don't remember why we gave up. But the book we wanted to write was World's Worst Boss. And we thought that would be a funny twist on things because I think one of the books that we realized was out there, instead of how to win friends and influence people, there was the antithesis of that, which was like how to lose friends and infuriate people. And we're like,
Yep.
that's interesting. I think we should and said, nobody wants to read a book on how to be the world's best boss. Maybe they'd read a book that has some humor in it and some lessons in it on the world's worst boss. That book still has yet to be written, but I know you had aspirations, and I did too, of writing a book back in our 20s. And now, fast forward 25 years later, how many times over the course of the last 25 years did it occur to you, I think I have a book in me? Was this something that you put on the shelf, or was this something that kept showing up for you?
Yeah, it's a great point, Rich. I had this conversation with you in our early 20s. I had it with others in my 30s. I had it with others at the beginning of my 40s that I want to write a book someday. I'd love to write a book someday. But what about? What do I really have that people care about? And you and I got a lot of training and a lot of development and a lot of learnings and very practical items. But where's the story? And so that I was always trying to figure out what that was. And it wasn't until that aha moment that I mentioned where I started seeing the patterns of my failures and going, wow, this is a pretty dramatic story of what happened here. And I want to apply these over here and prove them out. And these principles aren't something I learned in college, or it's not a class I took that I'm now putting into a book, or it's not a training I received or something. It's really my hard learned lessons of failure and success that I crystallized into these principles. And to now hold the book is unbelievable. Like the thought of having it, looking at it every day, it just gives me a tremendous amount of pride and joy. And yeah, you got yours as well. It certainly is an accomplishment. And the one thing I have said, Rich, on multiple occasions, this is my first book. I can tell you, I keep saying that intentionally because it was a tough and long road. That the thought of doing another book is frightening because this one took so long. But I feel like on the other side of this, I'm going to feel okay, I know how to do this now. I feel like if I have more stories to tell or learnings to crystallize, that this is a really good way to do it. And I'm encouraging others like yourselves to come along on that ride.
How did you overcome the fear, maybe? And I'm making an assumption that you had fear, but how did you overcome maybe reluctance to wanting to share a failure so publicly?
I haven't been a very vulnerable person throughout most of my life. I, I'd say that's pretty accurate. You know me better than anybody. Always wanted to put up a front, always wanted to be maybe something I wasn't yet, always wanted to try and, put up a really strong face even when maybe I was hurting inside, whatever it may be, right? And over time my leadership started softening maybe, where I did realize I could just be myself. I realized actually people liked me better as a leader when I was just myself. It was okay to not know the answer, like just small little things. It was okay to go to my team and say, guys, I made a big mistake. I apologize. We're going to pivot and do this. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe you just did that. Most bosses wouldn't do that. And I was like, okay, maybe this is the right way to build a strong relationship or culture in your business. And that kept going. And then on the other side of failure, it's everybody knows that I failed. Everybody knows I got fired. Everybody know, like, we had hundreds of people in this business that entrusted me to make the right decisions for the business, and I failed them too. And so to then go out and go, oh, it wasn't me. It was the victim mindset. This was done to me, and I should. It just didn't match my introspective kind of abilities. I've always been very introspective, but I haven't been very vulnerable. And so matching those two to me was a really important thing to learn. And I remember just even recently, I went to speak somewhere, and the introduction was that John sold his company and moved on. That was what the person said. And I had to correct him as I appreciate that. But the reality is I got fired after 15 years, right? I appreciate you trying to soften it, but that's not what happened. And I think that really connects with people because everybody has the ups and downs, right? And just it's through those ups and downs that you learn and experience pretty big moments. And I know you've been there as well, right? And had moments of the ups and the downs and what am I going to do here and picking yourself back up and doing other things. And I think that's life. And as soon as you recognize that's what life is, and it may happen to me again in the future, you know how to digest it the next time. It's that transition learning curve, but not hiding from it. Putting it bright, as Jeff Wall would say, get that flashlight in the dark corner and turn it on and see what's going on. I think I've now changed my style in that way, and it's been refreshing for me and others, I'm sure.
In your experience as a coach, as a mentor, as a business leader, do you find people want to know more about things on your ups or want to know more about things on your downs? Or do you find them equal? What do you find you're able to uh, grasp with others most often to impact their performance or their mindset?
Mm. I'd love to hear that answer from you too, by the way, after I answer this one, 'cause I'd love to get your thoughts on it. I feel like you can captivate people, and I could be wrong, but I think a lot of people who do keynote speaks or really talk to groups of people really lead with a story of failure and how that propelled them to success. And that blend of both of them connects with people. I think that's really a formula for really connecting with people at a deeper level, right? Stories connect with people more than just facts, as an example, as opposed to here's what I did and here's why I did it so well, follow me. But I think that works too. There's a lot of people who've had a meteoric rise in entrepreneurship that people listen to because they've done it, they've achieved it. It doesn't have to be a story of failure, but everybody experiences those ups and downs. Bringing people through the ups and downs through your teaching methodology, I think, is very effective because they can connect with you. Not everybody experiences that meteoric rise. And sometimes and I've done that too. I look at the Mark Cubans or the Bill Gates or I'm like, that's never, or Gary Vaynerchuk, or whatever. I can never be that person. I haven't achieved the success they have. I don't even know how to do that. And so you get into imposter syndrome and then you don't do it. So I think to connect with people, sharing those stories are very important. How do you
Mhm.
feel about that question yourself?
I find as a coach, when we watch the transition curve of those who we're working with, when they're really down on the transition curve, I find to share stories of successes of people who were in their position is often provides hope, provides
Mm,
inspiration. I find when people are really high on the transition curve to share some stories of some failures, of some things that went wrong when somebody was a little too high and they really weren't quite hungry enough. And it's actually a bit of the lonely road of a coach is I find really good coaching often takes the opposite emotional tone of the person who we're working with. When they're really high, we want to challenge them. When they're really low, we want to be more upbeat and more hopeful. So I
mm.
find both to be useful depending on where the person who I'm working with is at that
Yeah,
time.
yeah. Well said.
You had talked about when you first got fired, you stopped and went, "What happened?" And then you said, "What did I learn?" So let's get into your story.
Okay.
What happened and what did you learn?
Yeah. So through my entrepreneurial journey, I learned a lot. It wasn't just this one moment, but the end of, not the end, but the last moment of learning before I went through this whole journey here in the end is I had grown a business I had co-founded with some of my best friends. It was a hobby business. I grew it for 15 years. It was in an industry I loved. It's the sports industry. We grew it to north of $50 million in revenues, and we lost it all. Or I lost it all. I got terminated from the company I co-founded after 15 years of building it. And how that happened is really where the learnings happen, right? Which we can get into as well. But I ultimately lost everything that I was passionate about. I had the logo of that company tattooed all over my forehead and body. My best friends were in the business. It was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And we'd experienced tremendous success, but I lost control. And I got fired from the board and investors I had brought into the business, and they didn't see me as the right person to bring the company forward. And that was the painful failure experience through the end of the journey. And as I mentioned thereafter, picking myself back up, getting the learnings, applying that to another business, was able to successfully grow a business and apply those learnings and do it the right way and achieve the success that I was actually seeking in the first instance. But that failure and experience led to a lot of those learnings.
From what I know about story, you would tell here's a character who has a desire for something. They aim to fulfill that desire and they have a massive failure. There are learning lessons that they come back and use, and then ultimately they're successful. So, what I heard and what you said was you brought some investors in, you got fired. That's the what happened, and
Mhm.
that's the massive failure part. You, as the character in this story, what were you trying to do? What was your desire that led you to work with investors and then ultimately make that misstep? Where were you trying to go?
Yeah, that's ultimately a great question because that's at the root of, did I really have a purpose? Did I really know what I was trying to achieve myself? And I think the
Mm,
answer in that is I found out that I didn't. I was growing for growth's sake. I
you're
felt
in grow, grow. That's what you do. You grow.
that's what you do. You want to be a successful entrepreneur, grow a big business,
Yeah.
right? How many times do you hear entrepreneurs talk about how much money they raised, right? I raised $20 million for my business, or $100 million to our business, or we grew our company to 100 million or a billion or whatever. And you just think that's what success is. If I do that, we'll achieve success and it'll work for me. So let's just grow. And so I was trying to achieve a level of success that I thought was what I wanted. I thought that was my purpose. Let's build something significant. That will be fun. It's sexy. It's cool. I had a vision with the company. Let's grow this business to 100 million. So when we were a $10 million business, I met with one of the majority owners of the business, who was an investor invested in our company, and I said, "Hey, I think we can take this company to 100 million in 5 years." And by the way, I just read the book 10X by Grant Cardone. And I'm like, I can take this thing 10X from 10 million to 100 million in 5 years. I think I have the right game plan to do it. What I didn't really pay attention to was what equity ownership I had, or what investment capital we needed to do that, or how much bank leverage we would need to do that, or how fast we'd have to grow into different verticals, and on, which basically led us to need more capital to delever the balance sheet to invest in these other areas, which then diluted my equity, which then diluted my control, which then ultimately got me fired. Didn't think about that at all. I was just thinking, let's grow. And that was a big problem.
Was there a lack of values congruency? Was that part of it that you wanted something different than what your investor did?
That's a tricky question because I'd say yes, there was a values differential between some of the parties and myself, but I don't think it related to the point you just made. I think we wanted to achieve success in the business and create high value in the business. I had just made some mistakes in how fast we grew, maybe how carelessly we tried to reinvest our capital into other areas that didn't work, and then by diluting my equity and minimizing my control, they didn't feel like I was the person best suited to take this company where they thought they wanted to take it. That's not necessarily a
Uh,
values alignment. We both wanted the value of the company to grow, and our values towards the growth of the business were there. Now, did we feel the same way how the company should be led culturally? Did we feel the same way about the fact that I should have been let go as the co-founder, CEO, and president of the business? Do we have values alignment from an integrity perspective? That could be debated. But from a values on alignment in terms of what we were trying to do, yeah, we wanted to achieve the high valuation of the business, right? We both had that same intent. How to approach it was different, which led to my termination. But why I put myself in that position was me. That was my fault.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a character, John. John is in the dream business. He's always wanted to be in. He's been there for 15 years. He's surrounded by friends, trusted people, running a successful on all rights. He wants to grow, increase his skill, provide more opportunity for people. That's what successful entrepreneurs do. John, to do that grow, needed to bring in some investors because more capital, more growth. Easy equation. In that, lost controlling interest of the company, John gets fired. So that's the drop off. Now, in that story arc, if you will,
Yep.
there's learning. And then where I want to go next, just to foreshadow for you, is I want to know about some of the comeback. Let's talk about the learning. So this failure happens.
Mhm.
What's the learning? What did you crystallize in the book for yourself and for other entrepreneurs?
Yeah. So I'd say there's two parts to what I crystallized, to be very quick with it. I crystallized I needed to know what my intentions were. What was my true north? What am I trying to achieve? I didn't have that in that company. I had what the company was trying to achieve, but I didn't have as myself. What was my purpose? What really drove me? What am I trying to accomplish 30 years from now, 10 years from now, 5 years from now ultimately? I didn't have a life plan for me. Second thing is I didn't have my strategic business plan aligned with what I wanted. I had a strategic business plan, but I didn't have the why for me, and those two aligned. And that was a big problem, right? Simon Sinek says start with why. And so I would meet with my leadership team. We'd get around the table, I'd play the video, and I'd say, why do we exist? Who are we? What's our strategic plan? What are we trying to accomplish? We would do that for the business. I never did it for myself. I never took the moment of self
Mm.
reflection to think, what am I trying to achieve? And align those two pieces. So that's part one. And then the second part are 7 principles of entrepreneurial success. And I broke it down to 7 principles, which are grow and protect your equity, build and grow your own capital, reinvest smartly, create a culture of entrepreneurship, protect the house, protect everything you're building, access owner's liquidity on your balance sheet so you don't have to sell your equity, and move from CEO to chairperson. Those were the 7 principles that I then dissected from everything and applied to the other business.
And did you follow those 7 principles and that still led to you getting fired? Which ones of these 7 principles were revelations that had I done that, I wouldn't have lost the company?
All 7. I failed in all 7 areas of the principles in
Wow.
company A. And I have applied the 7 principles in the company we've achieved success with, all of them. And you will read in the book, even after we achieved our $100 million mark, we had a little bit of an oh shit moment that I actually happened while I was actually in the middle of this manuscript that
The
I've actually
OSM, if
included
you will.
in the book. What's that?
The OSM, if you will.
Yeah. And basically, when we dissected what had happened in this moment, the company had violated 4 of the 7 principles. And that's why we had found ourselves in a little bit of a trouble spot we had to get ourselves out of. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, here we go again," right? We missed on these principles. And I had learned even in the process of writing the book that if you miss on any 7 principles, you can put your business in pretty deep waters.
I'll ask you a question that we often ask others who are authors, and it'll be interesting being on the other side of the coin for you on, gosh, how would I answer that? All right, so there's 7 principles.
Mhm.
If every entrepreneur were to read one,
Yep.
what's the one they should read? And can you give a little bit more something tangible for a
Yeah.
to do for our listeners on here's a principle, here's what it means, and here's what you should do about that?
Yeah.
What's the one?
Yeah. That's an easy one for me, Rich, because
Okay.
when that starts in the book, the first paragraph says, if there's one principle in this book you must master, this is it.
Yeah,
So
good.
I have that one locked in. It's principle 2, build your own capital. And I think this is a big trap for entrepreneurs, and I'll give a couple of tidbits, but let me just state this to make sure I crystallize what I mean by build your own capital. Way too many entrepreneurs seek investors to grow their business. They go to the bank and get bank loans to grow their business. They feel like they need to have this capital in order to grow. But what they don't understand is that these external forces, whether it be investors taking your equity or banks putting leverage or asking for your personal guarantees or whatever it may be, puts pressure on you and the business. And the best businesses that I've ever seen, including the ones that where I've applied this, they build their own capital. So they're not reliant on other investors to have to invest in their business for them to grow, or they're not reliant on bank loans in order to grow their business. And so there's a way to do that ultimately is you build a product or service, you sell it, you make some money, you reinvest that money, you grow again. But here's the problem, Rich. And this is where I get a lot of entrepreneurs. And this got me. I would go to my team every year and I'd say, team, we got to grow by 20% this year. In some cases, I was saying 50% because we wanted to go to 100 million, right? I'm like, we got to grow 50% this year. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Where are we going to go? What people don't understand, what entrepreneurs don't understand, is there's something called the self financeable growth rate. It's called the SFG rate. It was a Harvard Business Review article that just hit me smack in the forehead. And it's how fast can your company afford to grow? The funny part is most companies' self-financeable growth rate is under zero, so negative. They don't have the money to be able to grow. So what do they do if they don't have the money to grow? They go get more bank debt, puts more pressure on their balance sheet. They go get investors to help grow their business. Their equity dilutes, and they get caught in this vicious trap. So if your self-financeable growth rate says you have the capital to grow at 5%, but you want to grow at 20%, you set your budget to grow at 20%, who's funding that 15% growth? Where are you getting that capital and how does that affect your business? And so the more you can build your own capital to build up your ability to grow with your own cash and reinvest that cash into your business, the more you'll protect your equity. And if you get those first two principles, you still have to apply principle 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, which I can discuss why. Because if you misstep on 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, you won't be able to build your own capital anymore and you'll lose your equity. So they all roll downhill pretty fast.
Interesting. I hadn't heard it described quite like that, but that describes a pattern that sometimes I see with some of our franchise owners where what I have said is when loans dry up, when the market shrinks, no longer can we finance bad decisions.
Yep.
So we can't go get that money. So to your point, when you were saying if your uh, self-financeable growth rate is under zero, then there's some house cleaning up to do before you should go grow.
Yes.
Because if in fact you go grow, you're just going to grow at an under zero self financeable growth rate. So there's some house cleaning to do to be able to make some profit. There's some difficult decisions that need to be made to be able to make profit. And then once you're on the other side of making profit and you have any degree of self financeable growth rate, now there's an opportunity to grow. Why is it bad for somebody who has a capital to grow at 5% and they say, I want to grow at 20? Why is that a bad thing? Because
Mhm.
they're on the other side. They're going to make more profit if they grow at 20. Why not?
Yeah. Oh, Rich, we can open the can of worms on this one, right? So I have to go in a couple of different directions. First of all, it's not a bad thing. If you want to grow at 20%, but your self financeable growth rate says 5%, it's not a bad thing. But how many entrepreneurs do the math and say, oh, okay, that means I need to go figure out how I'm going to cover this $1 million of capital that I need because that per 15% needs $1 million. And in order to do that, here's how I'm going to execute that strategy to protect my equity. And here's the right capital strategy. Jeff Unger from G2 Capital Advisors said, of all the CEOs I've ever met, there's not one of them who can show me what their 3 year capital strategy is.
Hmm.
Meaning, how are you financing your growth plan? Exactly. So we talk about that a little bit more in the book, him and I, in terms of how do you develop a 3-year capital strategy? 'Cause if you don't know where your capital is coming from to fund that 15% growth you want above your self-financeable growth rate, you're going to put yourself in trouble. That's how companies end up in debt. That's how they get over leveraged. They lose their businesses. That's what happens. So it's not a bad thing. You just need to have a strategy on how you're going to grow. The second part, which is a really important part, is you said if they get to 20%, they're going to have a lot more profit and they'll be in good shape. The self-financeable growth rate isn't calculated based on how much profit you make. It's calculated based on how much net operating cash flow you make. Okay? Because profit is vanity, excuse me, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash is king. So you can be a profitable business on your balance sheet, but your net operating cash flow is not as positive because of working capital constraints and other types of things. That's a very big distinction. And I guess the last part that I'll share on this point that you said so eloquently, if you have a negative self-financeable growth rate, clean up your house before you grow. What
Yeah.
ends up happening, okay, and I'll give you the example to my failure. We had a negative self-financeable growth rate, and I was like, let's expand over here, let's expand over there, let's expand over here. And we were making careless decisions. We were not reinvesting smartly. We were reinvesting carelessly. And what that did is it made our self-financial growth rate go lower the next year, lower the next year, which we need more bank debt, more bank, and you're not working right. You're not. So what happens then is you lose principle one. So principle three is reinvest smartly, exactly to that point. You have to reinvest in such a way that your self-financeable growth rate grows so you can protect your equity. Everything kind of ties to each other in that fashion.
So, talk to me about how this works. So, an entrepreneur is listening and they say, "Got it, John. Love it. Self-financeable growth rate. Uh, I'm buying what you're selling. I
Mhm.
really may not want to grow higher than that, or if I am, I need to be really aware that's something I'm doing." How is that calculated? In other words, is that retained earnings? So the entrepreneur gets paid their money, and then there are presumably retained earnings in the business, and those retained earnings are what gets reinvested. So is it where if you're running a $500,000 business and you want to grow by 10%, you should have $50,000 and that's your self-financeable growth rate? Does it work like that or some iteration of that? Or how can someone, what's the formula? How do they come up with this?
Yeah. So it's a more complicated formula. The formula is in the book, and we also have a workbook people can download and run their numbers through. But it's a much more complicated formula than what you just articulated. But principally, if the business makes $1 million in net operating cash flow, and we decide, you know what, since we had a good year, Rich, why don't we just you take half a million, I'll take half a million. Let's distribute that money to ourselves. You just got rid of all the cash you could potentially reinvest in your business, right? So that's point one is you have to take some of your investment to reinvest into the business in order to grow, right? If you want to have your own capital fuel your growth and compound your growth. So yes, it's very important. Retained earnings, how much you're keeping on the balance sheet to reinvest is important, right? But there's the second part of this, which is working capital. Okay. We have something in the book we call the cash flow ladder, where you can calculate for every $100 of revenue you do for a customer, how much cash does it take you to produce the revenue? Are you paying your vendors up front? Are you collecting a deposit from your customer? Whatever, there's a working capital number. And some people have a positive cash conversion cycle, meaning they get paid 30 days before they have to do any work. So they're getting the cash, and then 30 days later, they do the work and have the expense. And there's some businesses, Rich, where they actually have to do the work, pay the vendors and suppliers, and then get paid 30 days later. That's a negative 30-day cash conversion cycle, right? So depending on your working capital, you may or may not be generating the cash flow you need to reinvest in the business. So if your business made $1 million last year in profit, but one of your customers is Walmart and they owe you $1 million and they still haven't paid you yet, you still made $1 million of profit. You don't have the $1 million. They haven't paid you yet. Maybe they'll never pay you or whatever it may be. That's bad debt, different story. But if they decide to pay you 6 months from now, you have negative $1 million of working capital you cannot use to self finance your growth. So a lot of it has to do with working capital calculations, how much money you're reinvesting into the business, what your profit and gross margins are. So there's a whole formula on that.
Okay. So we're working with three different terms right now: profit, net operating cash flow, and working capital. I feel like the average entrepreneur listening goes, Yeah, I don't know how all those work together. I think
Hmm.
I understood working capital. Working capital is some derivation of your accounts receivable and your accounts payable, and how much money do you need to have available to be able to produce a widget, whether it be a product or a service. I think I got that. Profit is how much the entrepreneur is taking out of the business. Is that correct? Am I
No,
correct on both of those so far?
no, I would tweak what you said on profit. Profit is revenue minus expenses, or revenue minus
Yep.
cost of goods sold minus overhead expenses is your profit. That
Yep.
doesn't necessarily mean you're taking it out of the business, and it doesn't necessarily mean that profit number's in your bank account either.
Got it. Revenue minus expenses is going to give you your profit. Working capital is how much money do you money or credit, cash or credit that you need to have set aside. Or are you saying cash only is what you're including in working capital?
No, working capital is a combination of your ARs, your prepaid expenses or inventory, your accounts payable, and the
Yep.
timing differences between all of those to how much cash do you need to actually generate the revenues and profits you're generating.
Got it. And then the net operating cash flow. Describe that one.
Yep. So the net operating cash flow, which by the way, if you read the book Scaling Up by Vern Harnish, that cash section was written by Alan Milts. And I worked with Alan Milts a little bit on this book. And he said, look, again, he said very clearly, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, cash is king. And the number one metric and report that an entrepreneur should manage is the net operating cash flow. And I'm like, okay, how do you calculate that? And he has a whole webinar that I attended where he explained how to calculate it, and it changed everything. I was like, holy, you're right. But the way to calculate it, Rich, without getting into too much detail, is just give you an example, right? If at the end of last year, my accounts receivable was $1 million, which means I haven't collected $1 million that I was supposed to from customers by the end of the year, right? But at the end of this year, my accounts receivable is $2 million. My accounts receivable went up by $1 million period over period, right? Not only do I not have $2 million, but I have $1 million less than I had last year from a working capital perspective. And you have to do the same thing for your inventory and prepaids, and the same thing for accounts payable, and the same thing for your debt loads, and a whole bunch of different things. But the net operating cash flow calculates how much cash has come in versus gone out compared to last year. And did you generate positive net operating cash flow this year over last year? Yes or no? How much is that? That really is the measure of success for a business, because if you have generated more and more cash year over year, that's the cash you can then reinvest to grow your self financeable growth rate, to grow your business, and do it on your own capital.
You use the example of accounts receivable goes from a million to 2 million. And I know
Yep.
I'm trying to overly simplify things and I'm trying to do it verbally without looking in the book. And I understand it's going to be slightly incomplete.
Yep.
I just want to validate though, it's a combination of your accounts receivable and what you have available in your working capital. Because you could go from an AR of 1 million to 2 million while you're going from an AR of 500,000 to, or while you have a working capital of going from 500,000 to 2.5 million. And then you're actually positive on it. So it's some combination of AR and working capital that you want to be on the positive side of year over year. That is going to tell you how you're trending on your net operating cash flow. Is that correct?
Generally correct. AR is calculated inside of working capital. So I was giving an AR example, but to be more specific to your point, is your working capital getting better or worse? If you had the same revenues and profits, let's say that both years they had the same revenue, they had the same profits, but your working capital went from $1 million to $2 million. It now takes you $1 million more to run the same business than it did the prior period. That's negative $1 million of net operating cash flow you made. Even though your P&L may say you made $1 million, it's costing you $1 million more to run your business. Your net operating cash flow is zero, as an example. Versus if you do it the other way around, and you had $1 million of working capital one year, and now you have $500,000 working capital to run your business, you actually generate another $500,000 of net operating cash flow that year. So in general, that's how it works.
Got it. Thanks for that. I know we went down the rabbit hole of some financial stuff, which are some of the things that entrepreneurs need. And that's one side of the brain to work on. I want to flip to the other side of the brain and get some nuggets from you on the idea of developing a culture of entrepreneurship. When
Mhm.
I've mentioned that to other people, they've multiple people have gone, entrepreneurship. Did you make up that name? Is that an actual thing? So, can you define what is entrepreneurship and then give a few nuggets to how does an entrepreneur create this culture of entrepreneurship?
Yeah. A lot of this, Rich, we've developed together in our conversations with coaches and leaders. Would love your involvement in this conversation as well because it's a big one. And I guess to define it at first is entrepreneurs put a lot of capital at risk to grow an enterprise. So there's a high risk, high reward. An employee exchanges their time for money, generally speaking, right? And that's how an employee is. But right in the middle is an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is somebody who acts like an entrepreneur in your company. They treat their business like it's their own. They're motivated. They're well compensated. In some cases, they have a tie in to the growth of that business with the entrepreneur. But there's somebody that you view as one day this person could run this business. They're an intrapreneur, right? They may not have put the same capital you put up to grow this business, but they work in it as if it's their own and they're growing their own business and they treat it like that. So that's what an intrapreneur is. And how you create that culture, there's many ways to do it. I think the first way that we've talked about a lot on this conversation and episode of Entrepreneurs United podcast, or this podcast, I should say, is behavioral interviewing and hiring for core values and hiring the right people to start, hiring high performers and leveling them up as we talk about to become an entrepreneur. I do talk a lot about in the book as well concepts that you and I have learned from the 1 minute manager situational leadership model. To me, that was what helped me become an entrepreneur in the companies I was working in, developed a lot of my leadership style in terms of how to lead people situationally and with a servant leader mindset where the leader helps them accomplish their goals not only in professionally but also personally and becomes more of a mentor to them, creating that type of relationship and culture. I like to say our Ted Ma actually was the one I had heard this from first, right, on our podcast. Are you a manager, are you a leader, or are you a mentor? If you want to create a culture of entrepreneurship, become a mentor to your team. That's really important. And the other part I talk about in this, Rich, is the changing dynamics of the workforce. Today's workforce want to feel passionately involved in what they're doing. And one way to do that is really tie them into the success of the business. So I talk about some different instruments, like a phantom equity instrument, where the entrepreneurs in the business have some sort of value appreciation incentive that as the company grows, they can get rewarded beyond their paycheck and feel not just feel like an entrepreneur, but actually be somewhat of an entrepreneur in terms of their ability to financially gain from the business's success beyond their compensation on an annual basis. So that's another tool we talk about. But creating that culture is a very complicated thing. As creating a culture of a business is very difficult. But if you want to ultimately get to principle 7, which is move from CEO to chairperson, you got to build that team that someday may run your whole business.
And I can imagine every entrepreneur, when you describe what an intrapreneur is, they say, yeah, I'd love to have that. That would be great. Because the typical employee mentality is, how little can I work and how much can I get you to pay me for it?
Yeah.
And that is not the mindset of an intrapreneur. An intrapreneur treats your business like it's theirs. And they may or may not have an equity stake, but they certainly don't have the same equity stake as the owner. So, in the pursuit of wanting to build a culture of entrepreneurship, what's the most common mistake? How can a entrepreneur screw this up most?
Wow. Okay. As I give my response, I want you to think of one as well. So
Okay.
I'd love to hear yours on this. One of the biggest mistakes I see with entrepreneurs, and I did it as well, is when you don't follow that situational leadership model, as an example, and an employee does a task and doesn't do it appropriately, or comes to you and asks for help, and you decide as the entrepreneur, you're just going to do it. You know what? It'd be easier for me to just do it. I'll just do it. And so many times I work with entrepreneurs and I hear, my team can't do this. My team can't do that. They're not as good as I was here. So I just need to do it all. I need to get in it. And they have that mentality that if they don't do it, it's not going to be done at 100%. As opposed to applying some of these methodologies, we like, look, I got to train and develop this team. That's on me. If my team's not doing it right, that's on me. Maybe I didn't hire the right people. Maybe I didn't train them right. Maybe I'm not following the situational leadership model to walk them through the phases so I can just delegate them the task and they're going to go do it to my level. But a lot of times they externalize that. It's them. My team's not good enough. And when they have that mindset, Rich, it's really difficult for them to build a culture of entrepreneurship. Actually, I'd say it's impossible for them to develop a culture of entrepreneurship in that instance. So that would be that's what I see the most frequent. How about you?
It's funny you went there because a few weeks ago we had our Rising Leaders Summit where we had 180 people there. I believe it was around 55 franchise owners and 105 of their entrepreneurs. And then we had 20 of our corporate staff members there. And I co-facilitated a session with John Mamigan. The session was built off of one of Ted Ma's principles from his book, and it was around the differentiating helping versus developing.
Hmm.
And we think we're helping when we jump in to solve a problem when someone brings it to us
Yep.
versus developing the individual to solve their problem. And the core thing that we talked about with our audience was asking the question, whose problem is this to solve? Because so often it's just instinct when someone comes with a problem that we want to solve that problem. And putting a pause in there and asking, whose problem is this to solve? And often it's the person who brought the problem to us,
Yep.
and trying to work with them to develop them to solve their problem. What's funny is the best book I've ever read on this concept is actually a parenting book called Parent Effectiveness Training,
Hmm.
PET. And it talked about, as a parent, how often we fall into that trap. And the parallels between good parenting and good leadership just are never ending. Kid comes into you and says, "Hey," you say, "How did you do on the test?" And the kid says, "Oh, I didn't do great. The teacher asked all questions that they never even talked to us about when we were preparing for the test. They didn't even talk to us about all the things that they asked. Of course, I'm not going to answer it." And as a parent, you want to go, "Oh, I understand the problem. We should probably ask the teacher, why are they testing on things that they don't talk about? I think I'm going to email that teacher, or I've emailed the teacher a couple of times. I think I'm going to escalate this maybe to the principal, and we're going to find out what this is, and we're going to make sure you get." And we own the problem all of a sudden.
Yep.
Versus developing might be to ask the kid first, relate with the emotion. Wow, that must be really frustrating. Which we also, by the way, want to do in leadership when people bring problems to us, is relate with the emotion first.
Yeah.
Wow, that sounds really frustrating. Wow, that sounds really difficult. That sounds confusing.
Hmm.
Then, hey, what are your options on what you can do about that? Have you talked to the teacher? When might you talk to the teacher? And coaching them through what they can do to solve their problem. That, in that book, Parent Effectiveness Training, is the suggestion on how to identify who owns a problem. This is the kid's problem to solve, not yours
Yep.
as a parent.
Hmm.
And the kid needs to figure out how to solve that problem. And you as a parent need to be well differentiated between owning the problem and equipping them to solve their own problem. So it's
Yep.
funny you went there because, in a little bit different words, that's right where you went. And we didn't even talk about how we were teaching some of this stuff a few weeks ago at the
Yep.
very summit that this stuff was taught at.
Yeah, and Rich, I'll extend upon that parental advice you gave, which I think is fantastic. Is where I learned this the most, and it wasn't necessarily in where we had developed our skills on situational leadership. It was in a certain part of my career. I was a vice president of a logistics company, and I knew nothing about logistics, like absolutely nothing. But I was the leader of 1,500 people between the warehouse staff, the managers, the general managers, the Six Sigma engineers. and I had to lead that team. And so they could come to me with all the problems they wanted. I had no clue how to solve any of them, like none of them. I had to help and coach and guide because they knew how to solve the problem. They just needed my guidance and servant leadership to help them get to the right spots. And you can really tell the difference between a leader that excels in this area and who doesn't. I know for a fact I could put you, Rich, into any business of any specialty, and you would be able to lead the team there. I didn't say you'd be able to be the best producer, the best sales rep, the best engineer, but you'd be able to lead the team and get the team around the table to efficiently do what you needed to do. That's a good leader. And way too many times, the entrepreneur in a business was the person who first did that job, was the first sales rep, was the first operations person, was the first engineer or product developer or whatever. And so they have so much knowledge. It's so frustrating for them when the people can't do what they did. And so I think it's very well said. And if people just shut that mind off and go, no, I'm going to help them go through this problem, not as if I have the solution, but pretend I don't have the solution. How do I handle this? That's something I do today now.
And you've often said an entrepreneur in the early stages, they are the chef, the server, and the bottle washer.
Yeah.
So, in the early stages, it's most difficult for entrepreneurs to start to do some of this coaching for other people to own the problems because they've solved those problems. An entrepreneur would say, I've been the chef. I
That's right.
know how to solve that problem. Let me either do it or tell you how to do it. I've been the server. I've solved those problems. I'll do
Yeah.
it or I'll tell you how to do it. And it's the hardest thing in the world to watch a lower efficiency solution that you're having someone in your business execute, but that exchange for a little lower efficiency for buy-in that goes through the roof. They really own it. They're really in charge of what they do next. We've got to make that trade-off as good leaders is allow for a little lower efficiency solution in exchange for that higher buy-in that really lights people up.
Yeah. Said.
Let's come back. You had this launch at the Entrepreneurs United event and that summit and that experience. How was that launch for you?
Oh man, it was awesome. And I think, like I said, having the goal of knowing I have to have this prepared and ready to go by this event was really motivating. Literally got the book in my hands for the first time in Austin, Texas, in my hotel room a day or two before I had to present it to everybody. So nerve wracking, exciting, but also challenging and a good line to have it. And to have really close friends, mentors, business peers all there to launch the book was, yeah, was a highlight moment of my entrepreneurial career so far for sure.
I know having been there and experiencing the energy in the room and the vibrance you had up front, talking about what you had done, and it was just absolutely electric. And it was great to have been in the room for it. If there's one thing that you want every entrepreneur to hear, and you can't go back to the original one that's not necessarily a principle, or maybe it is. What's one thing that you want every entrepreneur to hear that they go, wow, I love the conversation with John. I want to take away one big thing and think about it over the course of the next day or two. What's that one thing they should be thinking about?
Why did you decide to be an entrepreneur to begin with? If you decided to be an entrepreneur so you could work 60, 80 hours a week, be fully stressed out, not spend enough time with your family, and go through all the trials and tribulations of entrepreneurship, okay, then maybe keep doing what you're doing. But if you decide to be an entrepreneur because you want to achieve wealth and freedom through entrepreneurship, what are you doing to achieve that? And I think that's really what I'm targeting in this book is if you have a lifestyle business and you're happy with where you're at, that's fine, stay there, it's all good. But if you want to build a high performance business to achieve really what you aspired and dreamed of as an entrepreneur, then these 7 principles of entrepreneurial success are essential. Do you want to be a business operator or do you want to be a business owner and own a business asset that can generate for you and your family?
When and where can people get a copy of this book?
November 30th, the book goes live on Amazon. I believe the pre-sale site is up on Amazon as well. So you can go to amazon.com and look up $100 million journey, or you can go to 100mjourney.com to learn more and get links there as well.
Congratulations on hitting your goal that we established together.
Hey, congratulations back as you hit yours as well. I can't wait to see what we have in store for next year.